the session, and I'm very glad to help you on that. Now, what we're going to do in this module, we are going to discuss the institutional triangle of the European Union. It's not probably the most interesting topic ever, but it's very important for your chairing. And in order to make it as useful as possible, I invite all of you to ask me questions whenever you do not understand something or you need further clarification. And the other thing that I would like to incorporate in this module is to see in details how the European institutional framework really is going to affect all the committee in Yerevan. So Mariam gave me the topics list. I have it here printed, and if you would like to have some more specific details on how your topic is going to be dealing with the institutional aspect of the European Union, you can raise your hand or whatever the Zoom device is, and then Mariam is going to let me know, and we can discuss that. Is everything clear so far? Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, Mariam, do you think we should start? Do we need to wait for someone else?
I would say let's start already. Also, in terms of Frank just joined. Perfect. Just joined.
Okay.
So just a little bit of the room before we start. So I can see that everyone has muted themselves, and that's amazing. So if you haven't muted yourself, please do, so we don't have any background noise. And then when it comes to questions, there are other options. So you can either raise your hand, you can see it on the panel. Can everyone see like a little raised hand thing? It's on the panel down below. I mean, okay, if you don't find the raising hand one, you can also just message in chat. So there is a chat here. I'm gonna just say hi. So if you have a question, you can also ask it in the chat, or maybe you can also wait until the end and then ask questions. But also Andrea will be asking questions throughout the module, so you can obviously unmute yourself and answer it, okay? Is that clear? I'll take it as a yes. Okay, so that's pretty much it with technical details. I'm gonna be recording all of this and then publishing on YouTube. And with this, I'm gonna give the word back to Andrea. And Andrea, also right now we don't see the full screen. It's just the window, just in case.
I'm going to launch it.
Okay.
Can you see the screen now?
Yes. Yes. Perfect. I can see it. Yeah.
Okay. So if everything is set, I guess I can start. Now, this module is about the institutional triangle of the European Union. That is the power structure that has been created in order to separate the powers of the EU. I would like to start this with a very, very swift description of the generality of how institutions are usually formed. Now, you are probably all acquainted with the principle of the so-called separation of powers. It was a principle introduced by the Baron de Montesquieu in 1748, when he wrote the famous book, L'Esprit des Lois, the Spirit of Laws, in which he suggested a way to ameliorate what was the current regime, that is the absolute monarchy that was common in all European countries. So Montesquieu basically didn't invent anything, because this principle was already well known, but he codified exactly how the powers should have been organized in order to make sure that they were balanced and there was no single authority overpowering the rest. Now, of course, there are three main powers in this scheme. There is the legislative power that is represented by the parliament in blue, the bottom left angle of this triangle. the legislative power is the power to make law, to do regulation, and basically the parliament is the institution that ascribe what must be done and what must be followed by all citizens and others institutions. In order to make sure that the laws passed by the parliament are implemented, there is another branch, that is the executive branch, also known as the government, and the government has the power to enact legislation. So to make sure that the law is implemented within the structure of the nation. Those who do not abide by the law must be prosecuted, and that is the reason why we have the judiciary branch. That is, of course, the top vertex of this triangle. Now, this triangle, you surely have seen it before, has, of course, a correspondence in the EU institution. But before we go and see that, it is worthwhile noticing that straight after, let's say, Montesquieu lived in the middle of the 18th century. At the end of that century, after the French Revolution, and especially with the independence of the United States, it came into understanding of the ruling class that these three powers were also, let's say, supported by another one, that is the economic power. Now, you should be able to see in this, okay, it's a bit out-pixelated, but you should recognize, of course, both the European Central Bank, the logo of the Court of Auditors, and the banknotes that you see in the $1,000. I put it there because the face that you see in there is the one of Alexander Hamilton, who created the Federal Reserve. And it's very important because he was one among the first ones to understand the importance of a central bank when it comes to policy. So from that moment on, there were, let's say, two new institutions that came to complete the already existing one. On one side, the central bank system, that is the system that has to regulate how the money is kept, preserved, and printed. And on the other one, and you see the example of the European Court of Auditors, the auditing system, that is an independent organization who is in charge of checking that, to put it bluntly, money is not mismanaged. Now, let's see how this architecture of power is structured in the European context. Now, you can see in this image, in the central one, around the circle with 7 stars, these are the 7 institutions of the European Union. By 7 institutions, I mean specifically the bodies that the Treaty on the European Union, also known as the Maastricht Treaty, established and to whom it gave formal recognition. Now, you see, starting from the top star and going clockwise, you see the European Parliament, the European Commission, the Court of Justice, the Central Bank, the Court of Auditor, the European Council, and the Council of the EU. Now, as we see earlier, there is the legislative power. In this organization, in this structure, it is shared by 2 institutions, the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union. The Council of the European Union is not to be confused with the European Council. The European Council is an institution wherein the head of states and government are basically meeting to provide general directions and guidance. So they do not exert direct political power. It's a mere strategy-making organism. The European Commission is probably the most difficult to it's probably the institution that is the most difficult to describe, as in other than executing, so other than representing the executive power of the EU, it also has some mixed competences. So it also has some little judiciary and some little legislative competences, but we're going to see them afterwards. Now, this is just the first picture that I want you to show. So we're not going into detail in every institution. We're going to see them better afterwards. The European Court of Justice, it's the judiciary. The European Central Bank is, of course, in charge of the printing of the euro and ensuring that the banking system works properly. And then we have the European Court of Auditor, that is the body that is, wherein the members actually check that the budget of the EU is appropriated correctly and is expended according to the indication established by the EU budget. So basically, it's an investigative body that will ensure that money is spent correctly. Now, we said that this module is called the institutional triangle, and you can actually see I represent it on the top right. The institutional triangle is the nickname that it's usually given to the three institutions that are the most prominent when it comes to power. These three institutions are, of course, the European Parliament, the Council of the European Union, and the European Commission. These three institutions, together with the three presidents, are those who, wherein the policy of the European Union is made, passed, and executed. However, other than the bodies that we see, there are other 4 bodies that are very relevant, and even if they are not institutionally recognized if they're not formally recognized as an institution, they are very relevant for your topic and the way you're going to chair, because as you're going to see, many committees will have to deal with these bodies. So it's good to notice them. So the first one, can you all see the slide, other relevant EU bodies?
Yeah.
Okay. So the first one is the European External Action Services. To put it short, is a diplomatic service. In our countries, it would probably be called something like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It also has it mixed both foreign policy and security and defense. It is chaired by one of the vice presidents of the European Commission, currently Federica Mogherini, and it's a very relevant body, especially when it comes to the topic of Arctic, which, if I'm not mistaken, Mariam, help me, it should be AFET, right? AFET is on the Arctic, and the two SEDES, the one that deals with PESCO, exactly, the one that deals with PESCO and the one that deals with cybersecurity. So if your delegates at some point are going to come up with something that needs to be demanded to the European Union, the body that is going to be charged with the implementation of this policy is going to be the EEAS, jointly with the Council, but we're going to see it afterwards. Then there is the B, so the European Economic and Social Committee. Basically, this is just an advisory body. It has no any specific power other than issuing opinions. It may be very interesting to check its work, because the documentation that they craft usually provide very interesting guidelines when it comes to especially social issue and the labor market. If I'm not mistaken, employment deals with the labor market and now is going to be shaped until 2030. So how to ensure that the social pillar is going to be given full actuation. So it might be interesting to, maybe you can tell your delegates to check the documentation produced by the EESC, because it is intrinsically focused on labor relationship and worker representation. Then there is the European Committee of Regions, that it's very relevant, especially for Committee on TRAN, ITRE, TRAN and ITRE. And again, it's a advisory body, same as the EESC. But the difference is that there is no representation of economics and labor forces, but it's instead basically the committee wherein all local administration from the member states are represented. So it deals with regional and urban policies. And at the end, this is very important for all committees, probably, the European Investment Bank. Now, we see earlier that we already have another bank, that it's the European Central Bank, and oftentimes delegates consider that as an institution that can provide money in order to implement certain policies. This isn't so, and it's very important to stop them when they start going to that tangent, because the European Central Bank has only been given the power to regulate the euro and more in general the financial stability of the member state. So it has no way to interact directly with the economy and the jobs creation, infrastructure creation, etc. However, the European Investment Bank actually has this role. So whenever your delegates would like to create a new program and they want it to be financed, make sure that they understand the role that the EIB has. Now, before I move on to, let's say, dealing more in details with the institutional triangles, is there any questions for what I've said so far? Okay, then I guess we can proceed. We see before that the institutional triangle consists of the European Parliament, the European Commission, and the Court and the Council of the European Union. Now, the first institution that we're going to deal with is the European Parliament, and it's also the first institution that it's mentioned in the Maastricht Treaty. And the President of the European Parliament is the first in the order of precedence. So in theory, it's the most important official of the EU. In practice, it isn't, but formally, it is. The main issue, the main tasks that the European Parliament fills is representation of the citizen. So it is the one European body that is elected by all European citizens. And in fact, it's charged with representing the will of the people. There are right now 751 members. That's called MEPs, members of the European Parliament. There are going to be less after the United Kingdom will have left the European Union. So at the next election, there are, if I'm not mistaken, going to be 705. It's very large because, of course, we have many member states, and every member state is represented in the European Parliament in a way that is proportional to the so-called electoral population. That is the population who is able to express a vote. It's not exactly proportional. It's called inversely proportional representation. That means that the bigger states tend to be a little bit penalized, and the smaller states have a bit more advantage. So, for instance, Germany has less MEPs than it is allocated, whereas Estonia or Malta or Cyprus, they have a bit more. This is due to the fact that the population is very different in every European member state. Of course, in the European Parliament, there are several political groups, and they sit transnationally. So you don't have the group of the French, the group of the Italians, the group of the Estonians. You only have the so-called political families. Now, as we seen earlier, the main task of the European Parliament, other than, of course, who represents the citizen, is the legislation power. So his task is to pass the European laws and budget, and this is done jointly with the Council of Ministers. If we think about our the usual parliamentarian architecture, the European Parliament is a sort of the lower house in bicameral legislation, say the French or the British Parliament. So the European Parliament is a little bit like the House of Commons, whereas the Council of Ministers would be a sort of Senate or House of Lords, as you wish. Other than that, it exercises so-called democratic scrutinies over the EU institution. It is which means concretely that has the power to investigate. Now, this is very important when it comes to, well, it's not, let's say that in general, it's a very important power that should be reminded to your delegates if they feel that something has been mismanaged. So if there is a certain program that has not been managed well by the European Commission, then the European Parliament can start a proper investigation. So the European Parliament is the body to address when scrutiny needs to be given to a certain either policy area, but specifically speaking is the execution of policy. Now, we're going to see afterwards how laws are passed, but the main difference that there is between the European Parliament and basically every other parliament in the world is that it does not have the power of initiative. So the European Parliament, the MEPs cannot on their own free will start a new pieces of legislation. They need to wait for the European Commission to have it. This is very important because if your delegates ask that a certain directive or regulation be debated, they do not have to address the European Parliament, but they first need to ask the European Commission to draft a piece of legislation regarding X. This is very important. The European Parliament is then going to amend it and vote it, but it does not have the power to initiate the process. Now, the Council of the European Union, that is not to be confused with the European Council, is the higher chamber of this bicameral legislative body. Whereas the Parliament, as we see earlier, represents the population, so the European citizens, the Council of the EU represents the member state, namely the government. So every government is represented by the minister according to the policy area that the Council is discussing. Now, this is a bit tricky, but the idea is that the Council of the EU has several configurations, one according to policy area. So there is the Council of the European Union for Agriculture and Fisheries, that's called the Agrifish Council. Then you have the one on economics, the ECOFIN, the one on foreign affairs, the one on home affairs, also known as the Council for General Affairs. In each of these configurations, every member state sends the minister who is in charge with that specific policy area. So in the Council on Foreign Affairs, you would have all the minister for foreign affairs of the European member states. In the Council on General Affairs, you would have all the interior ministers and so on. Now, this is, even though it might be a bit confusing because you hear about the minister from the national governments, so you may think, well, then it's an executive body. It really isn't. It's a legislative body, so it has more or less, in most areas, the same powers as the European Parliament. It's exactly like a Senate. There is a special mention that should be made, especially since there is an AFET committee, and this mention goes to the fact that the Council of Foreign Affairs has a quasi-executive power. So de facto, the input it gives to the foreign policy of the European Union, it is not only on the legislative issue, so drafting the legislation, but it also has the power to make the EEAS executed. I mentioned quasi-executive because it is not formally executive. lost this prerogative after the after the passing of the Lisbon Treaty, but de facto it still continue having it. And regardless of the other configuration of the Council, is the only one that is chaired permanently by a European Commissioner, that is specifically the High Representative. On foreign affairs, as we'll see later, the European Parliament is not as powerful and can only intervene with giving non-binding opinion. And this is due to the fact that foreign policy is still run, even after the Lisbon Treaty, is still run with the so-called intergovernmental method. That is, the European member states need to agree among themselves, and where instead most of other policy areas are agreed by the European Parliament, who represents the citizen. That is the so-called democratic method. In this area specific, it's still linked to the will of the governments rather than the people. In fact, as you see, the Council has the executive power to conclude agreements. So when you're going to discuss about the Arctic, you can address the Council of the EU to conclude or not conclude agreements within all those stakeholders that are represented in the Arctic question, or when it comes to cybersecurity and so on. Now, before I give space for question, let's go see the last vertex of the institutional triangle. That is, of course, the European Commission. Now, the European Commission was originally thought not as a political body, but as a mere technical one. So before Lisbon, and especially after the merger treaty of 1965, the European Commission was basically the technocratic organism that was in charge of providing the policy specification, and it was supposed to help the executive rather than be the executive branch. Before 2009, the executive authority belonged to the Council of the EU. Even if it was shifted gradually to the European Commission, and now in the last decades after the passing of the Lisbon Treaty, the European Commission has properly received, also in a formal way, the executive power to enact the European legislation. Now, in the European Commission, every member state is represented. However, the commissioners do not represent the interests of the member states, but are asked to represent the interests of the European Union as a whole. So even if they are appointed by national executives, they need to be approved by the European Parliament. And it's a very important power that the Parliament has. The Parliament can deny, can actually veto the presence of a certain commissioner who is seen as inadequate or whose policy is not in line with that of the European Parliament. So, yes, other than the executive powers that, of course, regards the implementation of the European policies and budget, as we see earlier, it has the exclusive right of initiative. So whenever your delegates suggest that a certain bill is drafted, or the first stakeholder to address is the European Commission. It also has a residual judiciary power when it comes to imposing sanctions and fines. This is especially relevant for the chairperson of IMCO, who's going to deal with shared economy, Airbnb, etc. If there is some so-called cartel or monopolistic or oligopolistic monopolistic position of a certain industries, the European Commission has the power to provide financial sanction. The most recent, if I'm not mistaken, was against Apple, and it had to pay several hundred millions of euros. So it's a very substantial power that it can be used whenever the internal market of the European Union is not as free as the treaty is originally intended. But as for the rest, so whenever there is a dispute that has nothing to do with the internal market, the relevant subject would be the Court of Justice of the European Union. So only in this specific issue, it is important to remember this judicial power of the European Commission. For everything else, the right institution is the Court of Justice, also known as the Court of Lux in Luxembourg. Now, before we link these three, all the institutions and see how they are intertwined in the architecture, is there any question or do you have any points to raise? Okay, then, now brace yourself because the image I'm going to show you next is very complicated and it shows the power structure of the EU. However, it's very useful, so I suggest you keep it in your folder while you're going to be chaired, because it really can come up quite often while chairing. So I think it's very useful for everyone to have it at hand. Now, this is an image that it's taken on Wikipedia. It has been I edited to make it as clear as possible. So you see, first of all, the colors of the bodies that are presented. In yellow, you have the bodies that have to deal with legislation. In blue, with the executive branch, and in gray, the judicial. Other than that, I also included the European Central Bank and the Court of Auditors, that while not formally belonging to the classical power structure, they are still a European institution and they're still very relevant. Namely the European Central Bank for econ and the Court of Auditors whenever there might be a mismanagement of the European funds. Now, in the green arrows means that a body either elects, appoints on the side on something. The red arrows is membership, and the purple arrows is the power of proposing. So let's try to see one by one. On the bottom, you have enfranchised people according to the electoral law of each country. It's a very fancy definition for the electoral bodies. So basically, every citizen who is entitled to vote according to the laws of the member states. Now, the electoral body elects directly, you see, the European Parliament, but also elects the national parliaments that you see on the top left corner. The national parliament, usually, it depends a bit on the institutional framework of every member state, but usually they give confidence to the national government, with the exception of France, Cyprus, and I think Latvia, but I'm not sure. But the idea is that in those countries that are not presidential, the national parliament usually has to grant the authority to the national government. At that point, the national government has the power to propose the members of the European Court of Auditors that are then need to be approved by the Council of Ministers. Yes, is there a question? I see something popping up. No, okay, sorry. Okay. The head of the national government, so the prime minister or the president in case of presidential system, and you see on the right, top corner, the head of state and government, so the authorities that holds the executive power, they all participate in the European Council, that once again, it's not to be confused with the Council of Ministers, or the Council of Ministers is another name for the Council of the EU. So the European Council is a body whose only tasks are the general direction and the strategy that the European Union should follow. It's more let's say it's more preliminary meetings that are followed, but then the political decisions are going to be moved to other European bodies. So it's quite unlikely, at least in my experience as an EYPer, I have never had to face, in my chairing experience, the European Council, but it's still good to know what the role is. The other very relevant role that the European Council has is that it proposes someone to hold the office of President of the European Commission. But it only proposes that because it then needs to be approved by the European Parliament. And you can see the green arrow that goes from the European Parliament to the European Commission President. Okay. Then we have the Council of Ministers that we already said that other than approving the European Court of Auditors, it also decides on the bills together with the European Parliament. This is, to put it briefly, the structure of the EU. It is very complicated. It's probably more complicated than we are usually used to in our in our countries, and this is due mainly to the fact that there has always been a lot of resistance to have a clear-cut power structure. Since the time wherein Charles de Gaulle opposed the European Commission to gain more power, the majority of the decisions were taken, as I said earlier, by member states, by agreeing on their own, trying to give as little as possible to the European institution when it comes to competences. This, of course, has resulted in this convoluted structure that is in constant need of reformation, and the Lisbon Treaty, that is the last treaty that has been approved, was not completely able to solve. But other than that, it's not probably the biggest concern that you're going to have when you chair. So this is just for you to have a graphic, to have an image of the structure, the current structure. Now, we see earlier that the Council of Ministers, so the Council of the European Union and the European Parliament, they both partake in the legislative process. There are 3 legislative procedures that have been recently amended that are mentioned in the Treaty for the Functioning of the European Union, also known as the Rome Treaty. You see, when I mention vide an article, it is the legal references. So if you want further detail, you can actually check the article of law mentioning this. Here, I present you just a short summation. The first procedures that it's commonly made in order to draft a bill is the ordinary procedures. So it starts with the European Commission issuing the proposal, and then there is a co-decision of the European Parliament and the Council of the EU. This is the standard. So it covers most policy areas, and what usually happens is that a bill is basically ping-ponged among the European Parliament and the Council of the EU until agreement is reached on its content. When it comes, and afterwards I'm going to show you the policy areas that are covered by each procedures. The second one is the consent procedures. Again, the European Commission issued a proposal. The European Parliament only has to consent, so yes or no, but the Council of the EU has the power of adoption. In this case, the Council is more powerful. It's the only bodies that can practically amend the proposal, and at the end is the bodies that has to adopt it in order for it to become enforceable. is the consent is not given. So the European Parliament can only veto basically the bill. If it denies consent, then it cannot be adopted by the Council. This might be very relevant when it comes to anti-discrimination law. If I'm not mistaken, the Committee on Civil Liberty, no, it's not Civil Liberty, the one on families and what is?
A jury, I think.
Jury, exactly. Jury is going to deal with the family law. So if it's something, if your delegates came up with something that falls under the umbrella of anti-discrimination law, in that case, the consent procedure is the one to be followed. The other committees that might be interested in that are, I suppose, AFET, because of course it's about the ratification of IMCO, if there is a trade agreement of some sort, yeah, that is basically it. So as you see, there is not a lot that should fall under the consent procedure. The third one is the consultation procedures. Again, European Commission issues the proposal, the Parliament issues an opinion. So it's an opinion, it's not a legally binding document, it's just a paper wherein it expresses the pros and cons that the European Parliament sees about that law, but that the Council of the EU, where the ministers are represented, has to adopt the legislation. As you see, the Council is not bound by the Parliament position. The only tricky aspect is that if the Council wants to amend the proposal in a substantial way, it must consult the European Parliament again. This is very important because it covers competition law, financial and fiscal matter, intellectual property, social protection, and family law. So family law, when it's unless there is a discrimination aspect. So the Committee on Jury, on Employment, on Econ, and IMCO, the chairperson of this committee may probably want to look at these procedures more carefully. Let's see here. Wait a second. Okay, legislative procedure is done. And now, another aspect that I would like to tackle is, before I give room for question, is the competence allocation. This is very important because beforehand we have only dealt with the European institutions, so the European Union stakeholder. However, as you definitely know, when finding the correct stakeholder concerning your resolution, oftentimes the national stakeholders comes up. So the governments, the local administration, etc. Now, in order for a chairperson to ensure that the committee does not confuse the stakeholder and address the relevant stakeholder, it is important to understand how the competencies are allocated. That is, what are the competencies that belong to the European Union? What are the competencies that belongs to the member state? What are the competencies that are shared? Now, again, the legal basis is the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, the Rome Treaty. In Article 3, it explicitly mentions what are the exclusive competences. Now, an exclusive competences mean, an exclusive competence mean a policy area that is completely in control of the European Union's institution. Only the EU may legislate and adopt legally binding acts. It's very important because those acts are going to abide by all member states. They can sometimes be amended, but only if the European Parliament allows member states to do so, or delegate the implementation of these acts to the member states. But in general, the exclusive competencies are completely within the reach of the European Union's institution. Then we have the shared competencies. there is the policy area, wherein both European institution and national institution are have to work together. The general criteria, that is also called the subsidiarity principle, is that the member state exercise the competence to the extent that the EU has not exercised its own. So to understand this idea is, if an area is not regulated in any way at the European Union level, then everything falls within the competence of the member state. Things change when the EU starts to act on that, and when it comes to the object of the legislation, then every member state must take into consideration the EU legislation. So the basis would be it's a competence of for the member states, unless otherwise decided by the EU. The third allocation, let's call it this way, are the competencies that are exclusive to the member state. I didn't wrote exclusive again because I didn't want them to be confused. So when it said, also for you to remember, when we're talking about exclusive competence, it's only meant as in exclusive of the EU. When it is competencies that belongs to the member state, we can mention them as the power of coordination and support, because of course we are going to look at it through the lenses of the European Union. So in these third areas, the European Union does not have a direct power, but can provide what is called the Coordination and Support Act. Coordination, it means try to make sure that the member states do not have radically different pieces of legislation, but they sort of all have a, let's say, a general framework. And the support as in trying to provide the common framework that ensure a sort of both coordination, but also of uniformity of implementation. In this case, the legally binding acts of the European Union, they do not entail the harmonization of member states. Harmonization is, again, a very fancy term to say that every member state must stick to the umbrella provided. Whereas exclusive competencies and shared competencies, they are going to they're going to force the member state to harmonize their laws and regulation. When it comes to the competencies that fall under the coordination and support, this does not happen. Now, this is a bit theoric. Let's see a bit more in detail what we're talking about. So the exclusive competencies that completely belongs to the EU are mentioned here. So the competition rules within the internal market, very important for IMCO, the customs union, ditto IMCO, the common commercial policy, the monetary policy for the Eurozone, conservation of marine biological resources, and the conclusion of international agreements. Now, when it comes to 6, it can be, to 5 and 6, they can be mentioned, they can pop up in the AFET when it comes to the Arctic, because the marine biological resources, so if they're going to mention the fisheries, etc., they are of exclusive competences of the EU. Even though we don't really have a lot of boundaries with the Arctic because Norway and Greenland do not belong to the EU, but just in case. Monetary policy, of course, can be relevant for econ. Shared competencies, so the central column, which is probably the most substantial, there's the internal market, that it's the market that is being created with the Single European Act. So everything concerning product and so on, the consumer protection, economic, social, and territorial cohesion, agriculture, environment, trans-European network and transportation, energy, security and justice. And then the 10 and 11 are pretty relevant for the topics that are going to be discussed in Yerevan. So there is the public health issue, namely a standard for medical products and devices veterinary and phytosanitary risk management. So the committee that is going to deal with livestock and the sustainability of livestock must make sure that the delegates must make sure that probably a lot of policy that are going to be proposed is to be falls under the shared competences. And also we have the social policies. There are not that many, and I mentioned them afterwards. So workers that are fired, labor union, collective defense, and condition for third country workers. This can be relevant for the Committee on Employment. The residual competencies, wherein the European Union can only exert coordination and support, are on economics, employment and social policies, industry, culture, tourism, education, vocational training, civil protection, and human health. As you see, there is human health. I should have specified that unless it follows under the competencies at a point that have been mentioned in the shared column at point 10. So point 10 is only for medical products, whereas the coordination and support is in general for tackling the human health issue. So the committee who is going to deal with the rare disease topic, those would probably mostly fall under the coordination and support column, unless delegates came up with something that has a specific concern when it comes to medical product or devices. Other than that, if it's just general principles, that is a more coordination and support. Now, this scheme is very important because you need to understand how your topic basically is going to be developed. And if you see that most of it falls under the coordination and support, it is important delegates tend to address the local institution or the national governments and national parliaments rather than the European one. Conversely, those who are going to deal with competition, international agreement related to the EU competencies, etc., those would fall under the exclusive competences. Okay, now, the last thing before I give floor to the question, as you probably have noticed here, there is a huge policy area that has not been mentioned yet, and it is the foreign policy. Foreign policy will also include the security and defense policy area. So this is particularly relevant for AFET, SEDE 1 and SEDE 2. Basically, the common foreign and security policy has usually been kept out of the proper framework of the European Union, but the member states understood that what with the fact that the European countries were no longer the mighty empires that they used to be before World War II, there was this sort of consensus that the best thing for everyone would be to try to act as much as possible as with a single voice in the international arena. And this is due to the fact that, of course, no European countries can compete on a, let's say, political level with China, the United States, and Russia. So even though there was no formal and legal agreement on giving the European Union specific competencies in foreign policy, there has been a long tradition of, as we said earlier in the module, intergovernmental method. That is, national governments that on their own decided to agree with each other so that the member state of the European Union can act in a coordinated fashion. With the Lisbon Treaty, it has been formalized that the European Union has a role in foreign policy, namely the External Action Service, as we see. and the actor that has not only the most prominent legislative competencies, but also the execution competencies is the Foreign Affairs Council. The Foreign Affairs Council is one of the configuration of the Council of the European Union. The Parliament, so the European Parliament, is not particularly vested in discussing policy, but has a very important role in providing funds to the European External Action Services. So it also has a power of influence. So as you see, foreign policy has its own special configuration in the institutional architecture. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I think I told you everything will go in a very summed up fashion. So thank you for listening. Is there anything you would like to ask? Any clarification? Maybe if you have something specific